चक्षुरुन्मीलितं येन तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः। अहोवकीयं स्तनकालकूटं जिघांसयापाययदप्यसाध्वी लेभे गतिं धात्र्युचितां ततोऽन्यम् कं वा दयालुं शरणं व्रजेम। नमः कमलनाभाय नमः नमः कमलपादाय नमस्ते कमलेक्षण यो ब्रह्माणं विदधाति पूर्वं यो वै वेदांश्च प्रहिणोति तस्मै तद्वंह देवमात्मबुद्धिप्रकाशं मुमुक्षुर्वै शरणमहं प्रपद्ये। The divine souls. We'll do a few minutes of Nam Sankirtan, and after that I'll continue with the topic of reconciling the various apparent contradictions of our scriptures. Radhe 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 Shri Radhe 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 राधे 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 श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
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 राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
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 मोहि दीन बना दे 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 श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
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 ओ राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
ओ राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
मोहि दासी बना दे 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 श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे
राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
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 राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
रस बिंदु पिला दे 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 श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री 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 राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे श्री राधे
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
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 ब्रज रेणु बना दे श्री राधे ब्रज रेणु बना दे श्री राधे ब्रज रेणु बना दे श्री राधे राधे श्री राधे राधे श्री राधे 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 श्री राधे ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
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 राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे श्री राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे
राधे राधे राधे
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे
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 मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे, मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
राधे श्री राधे,
राधे श्री राधे,
राधे राधे राधे,
राधे राधे राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
मुस्कानी दिखा दे श्री राधे,
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे,
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 राधे श्री राधे,
राधे श्री राधे,
राधे राधे राधे,
राधे राधे राधे,
राधे 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 श्री राधे,
राधे 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 श्री राधे,
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे,
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 मोहि श्याम मिला दे 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 श्री राधे,
तू कृपालु कृपा दे श्री राधे,
कृपालु कृपा दे श्री राधे,
तू कृपालु कृपा दे श्री राधे,
कृपालु कृपा दे श्री राधे,
राधे श्री राधे,
राधे श्री राधे,
राधे राधे राधे,
राधे राधे राधे,
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे,
राधे 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 श्री राधे,
ओ राधे 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 श्री राधे,
राधे 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 श्री राधे,
राधे 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 श्री राधे,
राधे राधे
Radhe.
Radhe 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 Shri Radhe.
Oh Radhe Shri Radhe.
Radhe Shri Radhe.
Oh Radhe Shri Radhe.
Radhe Shri Radhe.
Oh Radhe Radhe Radhe.
Radhe Radhe Radhe.
Oh Radhe Radhe Radhe.
Radhe Radhe Radhe.
Radhe 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 Shri 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 Radhe.
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 Radhe Radhe 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 Shri Radhe.
Radhe 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 Shri Radhe.
Oh Radhe 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 Shri Radhe.
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 अलबेली सरकार की. On Friday night, I was explaining about how Shri Maharaj Ji became Jagadguru and how he also received the title of Jagadguru Tam, the Supreme Jagadguru. And one of the reasons for that was that he was able to reconcile all the apparent contradictions that had baffled and bothered not only ordinary people but scholars for thousands of years. All those great scholars who came to listen to Shri Maharaj Ji at the Kashi Vidvat Parishad, they were the great experts of those days in Sanskrit language and in the Sanskrit scriptures. But as I mentioned, they all had their own silo of knowledge. They understood a specific part of the scriptures, and they could explain and debate on that topic or those particular topics, but they couldn't refer to in much detail to other areas that they hadn't studied in depth. And they certainly couldn't imagine addressing all the topics of our scriptures and reconciling all those apparent contradictions. This was beyond the dreams of any of those scholars. So when Shri Maharaj Ji at the age of 34 did that, they were, well, to say they were amazed is an understatement. They had no words. The only thing they could do was offer him the title of Jagadguru, and they felt that that wasn't enough. So they gave him the title of Jagadguru Tam. So let's just explore a little bit. What are the contradictions that had baffled scholars and even, of course, the general public as well, and that Shri Maharaj Ji was able to reconcile? Now, some of these, many or most, if not all of these, you could reconcile now, because Shri Maharaj Ji not only reconciled it in the language of the scholars, he reconciled it in the language of us ordinary, common public. That's the amazing thing, that Shri Maharaj Ji not only convinced the scholars and dispelled their doubts, he was able to present this philosophy in such a structured but simplified way that now even common people don't have to be confused about these things. And when I tell you the things that even great scholars were confused about, you may feel that, well, why were they confused about that? It's so straightforward. Yes, because you've been listening to Shri Maharaj Ji for so long, for you it's straightforward. So we'll touch on 3 or 4 of these briefly. I won't go into a lot of detail, but it will give you some understanding of what kind of perspective Maharaj Ji was able to provide that none of the previous Jagadgurus, let alone other saints, had been able to provide in thousands of years. Take the topic of God. Is there one God? Are there many gods? If there is one God, why do certain scriptures emphasize on this form and another scripture emphasizes on that form, and one saint taught bhakti to this form and another saint taught bhakti to that form? It seems like at first glance just a hodgepodge of different ideas about God, but it's not. It's completely systematic. Our mind is a hodgepodge. That's why divine philosophy appears sometimes unintelligible to us. But when a divine personality of the caliber of Shri Maharaj Ji presents a good, simple model for us to be able to understand the whole picture, then it all makes sense. Now, if you ask any scholar or you ask even an ordinary person, are there many gods or is there one God? Everybody will say there's one God. But then they'll also make statements like, there are many gods in Hinduism. Or they'll make statements like, I worship this God and I worship that God. So they're contradicting themselves. It shows that people have a misunderstanding. They'll say, if you question them directly, there's only one God. But then in their conversation, they'll use statements like gods, plural, or saying, I worship this God or that God, or which God do you worship? Things like that, that actually reveals the level of their misunderstanding. And this is true and was true in the time of Shri Maharaj Ji, even amongst those scholars. So even though those scholars would have said, yes, there's only one God, then they would have argued amongst themselves. God is formless, one scholar would have said. And another scholar would have said, no, God has form. And then if you ask the ones who all agree that God has a form, okay, then who is God? One would have said Krishna is God. One would have said Shiva is God. One would have said Durga is God. And they would have argued about that. And then if you question them, but God is one, right? Yes, God is one, but God is formless. And the other one is saying, yes, God is one, but God is Durga. So there was a confusion. How did Shri Maharaj Ji reconcile it? It's not that he created a new philosophy. He took the verses and the quotations from our scriptures, but put it together. He extracted that essence of that knowledge so that even a child, all the way from the topmost Sanskrit scholar to a child, could understand how all these forms of God are one, and how one single God is formless and with a form, and is Durga, and is Shiva, and is Krishna, all at once. And you've heard him explain this many times, but I'll just review it briefly with you. Mainly, the most important quote is from the Bhagavatam. Although, on a more basic level, Ved says, Dvaivava Brahmano Rupe Murtan Chaiva Murtan Cha, that God has two aspects, with form and without form. But Bhagavatam expands on this idea by saying Vadanti tat tattvavidas tattvam yajjnanamadvayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti shabdyate. This statement has been there in the Bhagavatam since Vedavyas Ji wrote it down 5,000 years ago. And it was referred to in the Sanskrit writings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Ji's great disciples like Jiva Goswami, Rupa Goswami. They referred to this shlok and explained, especially Jiva Goswami in his Paramatma Sandarbh, part of his Shat Sandarbh. So the explanations are there in our scriptures and even from our great historical acharyas. But Maharaji took it in such a way that he brought it before common people and he brought it before the scholars, and he allowed them to debate it in their mind as he spoke. You've seen the way he speaks. He'll take one side and say, but this, and then he'll take the other side and say, and this, and then so he's having that argument for you. He's bringing up all of your doubts and all of your questions, and he's debating it all right in front of you, so you don't have to debate him or question him. He's bringing it all out. He did that to the scholars. So when he explains this shlok, he says there's one single supreme power. One advaya jnana tattva, a singular, supreme entity, power, tattva, who is beyond everything and who is the support of everything. So whether you call that power God or Ishwar or any word in any language, there's one single supreme power. But that supreme power has unlimited powers. That supreme tattva has unlimited powers. And those powers mean that God has a personality and can reveal certain aspects of that personality or conceal certain aspects of that personality. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. We all do the same thing. We can behave formally, we can behave playfully, we can behave in an angry way, we can behave in a loving way, or we can just be quiet. We can reveal all of these parts of our personality are there. Just because a person is behaving in a very serious manner doesn't mean they're not playful. They're just not revealing that. Just because a person is behaving in a very naughty way doesn't mean they're not serious. They're just not revealing that side of their personality. So if we can do that, and we are beings of such limited capacity, then why would it be a surprise that God could do the same when He has unlimited powers? So to keep it simple, out of all those powers, if only enough is being revealed just to maintain God's existence, His satta, then He is formless. He has no other qualities revealed other than being a formless divine truth, a formless divine bliss. There's no form, there's no name, there's no leela, there's no divine abode. There are no other qualities that you could speak of, like being playful or naughty or serious or angry or anything, because none of God's qualities are revealed in this aspect called Nirakar Brahm. So that's the one that some scholars like to refer to, formless God. Okay, so formless God exists. When all of God's powers are dormant or not revealed, except just enough to maintain His existence, that's Nirakar Brahm. But the same God also can reveal those powers in part. Then He's called Paramatma. So the first one, Bhagavatam refers to as Brahm. The second aspect is referred to as Paramatma. all the forms like Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, all the forms that Vishnu takes when he comes on earth, like Narsingh, Vaman, Kachap, Matsya, Parashuram, these are all forms of Paramatma. Whereas Brahm has no divine abode, no leelas, no actions of any kind, no qualities of any kind other than just a divine existence. Paramatma has a divine abode called Param Vyom or Vaikunt. This is where all these almighty forms of God exist. They are all manifestations of God's glory, power, almightiness, graciousness, and blissfulness, but in different ways. They are not many, they're one. But just like we can reveal different aspects of our personality and we can even change the way we look, God, with his unlimited power, can reveal his almighty glory in different forms. However, in this form, it's not considered to be a total revelation of the divine personality of God because there are no leelas. In this form, God doesn't play or interact with his devotees at all. There's nobody in the divine abode of Almighty God who gets to have a close association, a personal relationship with God. The closest you can be is how close a subject is to their king or queen. So there is a relationship, but it's a distant relationship. That same Brahma, when none of the powers are revealed, is Paramatma when some of the powers are revealed, and the same Brahma and Paramatma are Bhagwan when all of the powers are revealed. When all the powers are revealed, then God reveals his playful, intimate side, his loving side. That's called Bhagwan, Shri Krishna. And a slightly reserved form of Shri Krishna is Shri Ram. As Shri Krishna, everything is revealed in totality. And since out of all of God's powers, the absolute supreme power is the power of divine love, so when Shri Krishna reveals that power of divine love, all the other powers are submerged in that. They lose their... You don't notice them. Their significance becomes negligible. Just like there may be a full moon in the sky. Sometimes you get both the sun and the moon in the sky at the same time, a little bit offset from each other. Before the sun rose, the moon was looking very bright and important. And then once the sun rose, the light of the moon became negligible, not less, but insignificant compared to the light of the sun. Similarly, when Shri Krishna reveals his divine love power, all other divine powers, knowledge, almightiness, it all becomes insignificant. It just merges or submerges into that power of divine love. So this is why we say, if someone really asks, okay, you say God is one, and then you tell me God has many forms, so who is that one God? Interestingly, scholars rarely they rarely can untangle the net of confusions in their mind enough to get to that point to ask that question. Kids ask that question. Okay, you're telling me God is one. Then who is that one God? Is it God, or is it Krishna, or is it Nirakar Brahm, or what? Just tell me. So it is Krishna. Krishna himself is who he is when all of his power is revealed. He is Krishna and nobody else. Radha Krishna. If he's slightly in a more reserved form, that divine love aspect is not revealed in totality, then Krishna is Ram. It's the same Krishna. And if he just conceals that lovingness completely, so only his divine almighty glory is revealed, then he has many forms like Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, and all the other forms that we know of. They all come in this Paramatma category, but it's none other than Radha Krishna, revealing their almighty aspect. And if the same Shri Krishna conceals all of his powers, then he can be experienced as formless. It's like one time Narad Ji was coming down from Swarg to visit Shri Krishna in Dwarika. So when he was very high up in the sky, the residents of Dwarika just saw a very bright light. And they were all looking, oh, what is that? And then when he came a little closer, they could see within that effulgence, there was some kind of human form. But they still couldn't recognize who it was. And when Narad Ji came all the way down, then they said, oh, it's Narad Ji. That's like Brahm, Paramatma, Bhagwan. It's not three different personalities or three different entities. It's the same entity, the same Shri Krishna. From the greatest distance, Nirakar Brahm, just the light of his body. From some distance, Paramatma, you can see, but you can't touch. And close, your Krishna. Oh, it's Narad Ji, like that. Oh, my Krishna. It's the same Krishna in all three situations. So whether Krishna is revealing himself in his loving form, as you can say in his original form as Krishna, or if he's presenting himself as Almighty God, or if he's actually formless, it's the same Krishna. But don't think that Krishna is jumping back and forth. 1 second he's formless, then he becomes Vishnu, then he's Krishna, and then he becomes something else. He's all three simultaneously and eternally. He's always formless, and he's always almighty, and he is always Krishna. But the original source of the entire divine phenomena is Shri Krishna. That's why in Gita, Shri Krishna himself says, Ye yatha mam prapadyante tas tathaiva bhajamyaham mama vartamanu vartante manushya partha sarvashah. Shri Krishna tells Arjun, there's only me, there's nobody else. Whoever is worshipping God in any form is worshipping me. Mama vartamanu vartante manushyaha partha sarvashah. In every way, whoever is worshipping God in any way, they're all worshipping me. And I will come to that person in whatever form they worship me. I have no preference of my own. However they worship me, I will come to them. However you surrender to me, I will come to you in that form. I will love you in that way. Such a simple statement of the Gita, but it reconciles the whole thing. All the forms of God are included and incorporated in the personality of Shri Krishna. So when somebody questions, is there one God or many gods? No, there's one God. And that God is Shri Krishna, but those other forms, his other forms, are not other. They're none other than him. Any more than when Narad Ji was so high in the sky, he was just light. That wasn't somebody else. It was only Narad Ji, nobody else. And when he was close enough to see a form but not to recognize him intimately, that was also none other than Narad Ji, not somebody else. So we should never think that these various forms are some other form. They are none other than Shri Krishna, none other than Radharani. There is nobody but Radha and Krishna, nobody but them. But they can present themselves or reveal themselves in these forms. If somebody is not at that level to be able to accept it in the way I just described, they can learn it in a more general way. We can just explain about Brahm, Paramatma, and Bhagwan. And if God is revealing all his powers, he's Bhagwan. If he's revealing it in part, he's Paramatma, he's Almighty God. And if he's not revealing any powers, he's Brahm. That's enough for most people, just to reconcile their understanding of why there would be so many different forms of God. Well, it's easy to understand if you just use this model of Brahm, Paramatma, Bhagwan. Every form of God will fit in one of those three categories, and you know that they're all one. It's just a question of what power is being revealed and what power is being concealed. So it's very simple. You can teach this model to a young child, and they can understand and accept that, oh yes, okay, God. Vishnu is not separate than Krishna. Vishnu and Krishna are one and the same. It's just that Vishnu is like the Krishna when he goes to the office, and Krishna is his form when he comes home and he's playing with his family. But they're one and the same. And Brahm, formless God, is Krishna when he's sleeping. None of his personality is revealed in his sleep. So even a child can understand this. And a scholar can also take all these scriptural references to all these various forms of God and reconcile it into this one elegant model. The truth, when it's explained by a divine saint, shouldn't come across as complex. The elegance is in the simplicity. If somebody can't present it in a simple way, then they haven't really understood it. So Shri Maharaj Ji took this complex philosophy, which is explained in so many volumes about the forms of God, the personality and powers of God, and he presented it for the world to understand that God is one. So when this saint is worshiping that form of God, it's not contradicting another saint who's worshiping another form of God. God reveals himself in different ways and reveals a different type of bliss. So if you want to do Rup Dhyan on the smile of Radharani, like we were just singing, so it means you're attracted to a certain type of ras. You want that personal, intimate ras that Radha Krishna give. And if someone else prefers to do Rup Dhyan of Mahavishnu sitting on his throne in his darbar with divine personalities like Sanakadik Paramahans and Naradji sitting there in his court and everybody's admiring his divine beauty and greatness, somebody might prefer to do Rup Dhyan on that. When they attain God, they'll receive that type of bliss. That doesn't mean one is right and one is wrong. Just like different people are not going to agree on what their favorite food is. So if your favorite food is pizza and your favorite food is gulab jamun, would it make sense to argue? People would think you were crazy. They know that, no, it depends on your likings and your sanskars and all of these things come into play. Oh, you like gulab jamun? That's great for you. I like pizza. It's the same with the various forms of God. To argue that one form of God is greater and one form of God is less is craziness. Whatever appeals to your mind, whatever is easy for you to do Rup Dhyan, adopt devotion to that form of God. Whatever is your goal in the divine world, if you want a close, intimate relationship or you want a more distant relationship, accordingly worship that form of God that gives that type of divine bliss. No judgment required about who's better. All the forms of bliss are infinite. Just the flavors are different. Sweeter, more sweet, more sweet. There are differences there, but all of them are sweet and all of them are unlimited divine bliss. Sri Maharaj Ji explained this, that the various forms of God give different types of bliss, so you choose which form of God according to which type of bliss you want to get. Do you want to take part in the Leelas? Then worship Sita Ram or Radha Krishna. Do you want to just visualize God from a distance? Worship any form of Paramatma, Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, etc. The choice is yours. So this is why all the saints were correct. No matter whom they were worshipping, they were all correct. There's no need to debate or argue about it. One Puran is telling all about Shankar Bhagwan. One Puran is telling all about Vishnu. One Puran is telling all about Durga. One Puran is telling all about Krishna. So somebody says, see, no, this Puran is right. Look, it's telling Shivji is Supreme God. Yeah, he is Supreme God because he's a form of Krishna. There's no argument. So for the devotees of Lord Shankar, there's a Puran for them, Ling Puran. For the devotees of Vishnu, there's Vishnu Puran. For the devotees of Durga Ji, there's Devi Puran. For the devotees of Shri Krishna, there's Bhagavat Puran. There's no argument. They're all right. They're all correct. So this is what Sri Maharaj Ji explained. He reconciled this complexity and the apparent confusion about all these forms of God. He simplified it into this elegant model of Brahm, Paramatma, Bhagwan. But for the devotees who can understand at a little higher level, he did explain that that one single supreme original form of God is none other than Shri Krishna. Some people want to say, they think it's more polite or politically correct if we would invert it and say, no, God is originally formless, then we don't insult anybody. The original supreme form of God is formless and all the forms come out of that. So then, it's easier for a material mind to think of all those forms as being equal if they all came out of a formless divine existence. But that's not the reality. The reality is that Shri Krishna is the supreme divine tattva. All powers are within him and all the forms emanate from his personality. But if someone can't understand at that level, it's okay, it's enough just to understand about Brahm, Paramatma and Bhagwan and how all the forms are one. This even incorporates the forms of God worshipped in other religions. Although technically speaking, there is no form described in any other religion other than Sanatan Dharma. There is no form of God in any other religion. But their description of God, their conception of God is also incorporated into this model of Brahm, Paramatma, Bhagwan. So it also eliminates the argument between various religions that my God is the right God. And someone else is saying, no, my God is the right God. So someone who understands this philosophy of our Ved, if someone from another religion comes and says, my God is the right God, the one who understands the philosophy will say, yes, I agree. Your God is the right God. No argument there. Your God is God. There's no such thing as a Muslim God and a Christian God and a Hindu God. There's only God. Now we know that Mama Vartamanu Vartante, Shri Krishna says, I am God for everybody. So there's a good analogy. If somebody's living in a kingdom, they don't know who the king is, but they know there's some king. And they have a request from that king that they want to make known. So they can write a letter and say, oh, dear king, I wish to have an audience with you and I want to ask you for this thing, and write that letter, and then on the envelope put the king and give it to the mailman when he comes by. The mailman will take it to the king. He doesn't need the full description, "O king who wears a golden crown and is named so and so," and just the king in general, right? So that message will get to the king. So anybody who's thinking of God in any way, no matter how vague their conception of God is, whether they have no idea what God looks like, what God's personality is, but they believe in God, Krishna says they're thinking of me. I'm the king. It doesn't matter if they have no clue what I'm like. I am God for everybody. Now again, there are very few people who would understand it at this high level. For most people, it would be better to understand it in a more general way, just saying God is one, so we don't have to argue about your Christian God is right, or my Muslim God is right, or my Hindu God is right. God is one. So you can call God by any word, Anantanama Rupaya. Use any name, think of God in any form, and you are right. You're all correct. There's no need to argue. No need to prove someone else wrong in order to make yourself right. That's what people fear. Well, if he's right, how can I be right? If his God is right, then my God must be wrong. No, it doesn't work like that. Because you all have the same God. You're calling him by different names. You have different descriptions of God in your holy scriptures. But your God is God. So you wrote a letter to the king. Someone else had heard that the king is very strong. So when he wrote a letter to the king, he wrote, "Oh, my strong king." And he sent that letter. So does his letter go to a different king? No. The king is the king. So everybody is worshiping the same God, no matter what they call him, no matter how they conceive of him in their mind. Shri Maharaj Ji explained this. So he not only reconciled the philosophy of Ved and Puran and Darshan Shastras, he also respected all the religions. He accepted all the religions and said we're all worshiping the same God. Now, for the devotees who could understand on a deeper level, he would explain that that God is Krishna. They are also worshiping Krishna in other religions, but they call him by a different name. That's fine. We don't have to argue that or prove that to anyone. We know that and understand that. So this is one big confusion, such a complex contradiction that Sri Maharaj Ji just reconciled into one simple format that everybody can accept and understand. And he said that same God is in everybody's heart. Your Krishna, if you think of Krishna in your Rup Dhyan, your Krishna also resides in somebody's heart who calls God by a different name and conceives of God in a different way. The same, your Radha Krishna are in that person's heart. The person who says, I don't believe in God, your Radha Krishna are sitting in that person's heart as well. In other words, Maharaji not only intellectually dispelled the confusion, but he also urged people to give it a practical application. Understand that there's one God and that one God resides in everybody's heart. So never knowingly or willfully cause harm to anyone, because you know that you're actually hurting Radha Krishna who reside in their heart. No matter if the person is your enemy, if the person is the enemy of Radha Krishna, you don't want to hurt them because you'll be hurting Radha Krishna sitting in their heart. So with this philosophy about the oneness of God and this practical application of seeing God or understanding that God is in each and every person, even if the people of the world understand and accept just this much, how much that would affect people's behavior with each other, how much that would affect the society. We would still need laws to regulate our interactions, but it would change the whole outlook that people have towards each other and how they behave in the world. So this is one thing. Maharaj Ji explained about the oneness of God and the oneness of all religions. It doesn't mean all religions are the same. Don't think that. One religion may only have a very brief explanation of God, just in a very general way, like God is supreme, God created the universe, God knows what you're doing and He'll give you the consequences. That might be the totality of the explanation in one religion, which is enough for the people in that religion. It's also not wrong, it's correct. But it's just this much part of the philosophy. If you want to know more, what does God look like? What is God's personality? When God comes on earth, what leelas does He do? Those details aren't in that religion or that philosophy. So there are differences in the religions. We're not saying that all religions are the same. But whoever is worshiping God is worshiping the same God. That's the main point. So there's no reason to dispute about which religion is right or wrong. However, if you want the complete description, where you'll find the most detail and the most depth, of course that's only in Ved and the other Vedic scriptures. When it comes to the path to God, how to get to God, again, scriptures and saints tell so many things. Someone says do devotion, someone says do tapasya, someone says do yoga, someone says get gyan, someone says meditate. There are so many different ways, not just told by saints, but actually described in our scriptures. But even that Sri Maharaj Ji reconciled. He told that all of these practices are good practices, but what are you using to do these practices? You're using your body, your senses, and your mind, and all of those are mayic. So you're bound by Maya, your faculties are mayic, and you're trying to reach beyond Maya to God. How will you do it? Through your practices or your own personal efforts? You can't. No amount of material effort can result in a divine attainment. It's impossible. It's illogical. So you do however much tapasya you want, be greater than Vishwamitra. You do however much meditation you want. Do however much yoga you want, get great siddhis. Hold your breath for hundreds of years. Float above the earth. You can develop these siddhis and you're still under Maya. If you die, if that great yogi dies, he'll be reborn. He's not beyond Maya. Then what do we have to do? Maharaj Ji said it's simple. You want to get beyond Maya, go to the one who owns Maya. Mayam tu prakritim vidyan mainan tu maheshwaram. Shvetashvatra Upanishad. Maya is Shri Krishna's power. Daivi hyesha gunamayi mama maya duratyaya mameva ye prapadyante maya metam tarantite. Gita. Sodasi raghubir ki samujhe mithya sopi छुटे न राम कृपा बिनु नाथ कहु पदरोपी. Shri Krishna says in Gita, Maya is my power and no one can cross it without my grace. You surrender to me, I'll take you across. And Ramayana says, don't think that Maya is some illusion. No, Maya is God's power, God's servant. And without God's grace, no one can cross Maya. So, nayam atma pravachanena labhyo na medhaya na bahuna shrutena. Do anything, Kathopanishad says. you'll fail to reach God because all of your efforts are material. Then how to reach Him? Surrender to Him. That's it. Surrender is the path. No matter where you live in the world, no matter what your goal is in attaining God, if you want to reach God, you have to surrender. And the path of becoming surrendered is bhakti. So there's only one path to God. There aren't many paths. There are many practices that can develop the sattvic qualities of your mind, but there's only one path to reach God, and that is the path of surrender. Bhakti means surrender. This is also not excluding anyone. The one who is following the path of Gyan or the path of Yoga or the path of Karma, it's not excluding them. Just means that whatever practice they're doing, they have to submit it to God. They have to surrender their efforts to God, whatever they're doing. So it's an inclusive philosophy. It's again not telling anybody they're wrong. You're all right, you're correct, it's fine, whatever you're doing is good, but you have to surrender yourself to Krishna. Don't think you can reach God on your own. Understand that your efforts are limited, so you have to surrender to God. Become humble. Give yourself to Him. Then He'll take you across Maya. So this is also a simple philosophy for everybody. Maharaj reconciled all these paths, although it was clearly said in so many places in our scriptures. Bhakti revainam nayati, bhakti revainam darshayati, bhakti revainam pashyati. Ved saying only bhakti will take you to God. Bhaktya tvananyaya shakya ahamevam vidhorjuna. Gita. Naham vedairna tapasa nadanena nachejyaya. Gita. Arjun, these practices won't take you to me. You have to do bhakti. You have to surrender to me. Na sadhayati mam yogo, na sankhyam dharma uddhava, na swadhyayas tapastyago, yatha bhaktir mamorjita. Bhagavatam. Shri Krishna is telling Uddhav, none of these practices will captivate me. If you want to capture me, you want to reach me, you want to attain me, there's only bhakti. So although that was clearly stated at so many places in our scriptures, but Shri Maharaj presented it in a way that everybody could understand and accept. That your practices are not wrong, it's just that they're limited. So surrender your practices to Shri Krishna. Surrender yourself to Shri Krishna in whatever style you want to, you have to surrender. So just like understanding the oneness of the forms of God was inclusive, it didn't exclude anyone. It said whatever conception of God you have, that's included in the form of Shri Krishna. So we're all worshipping the same God. In the same way, Shri Maharaj said, including everybody, that whatever you're doing, just surrender it to Shri Krishna. So no path is right or wrong. They're all wrong if you're not surrendering to God. And they're all right if you're surrendering to God. So surrender is the main thing. The style of your surrender may change as compared to another person. That's fine. But surrender is the main thing. Bhakti is the main thing. We call it bhakti. So we know bhakti is the only way to reach God. And then, although there are so many styles of doing bhakti, see, this is another confusing thing that people can argue about. Yeah, well, this saint said do murti puja, and this saint said do jap. And again, no scholar could reconcile this. Shri Maharaj said it's simple. Alodya sarva shastrani vicharya cha punah punah idamekam sunishpannam dhyeyo narayano hari. Ling Puran. Vedavyasji has already told us the essence of everything is attaching our mind to God. It's the mind that has to be surrendered. So you have to give your mind to Shri Krishna. Whatever form of bhakti various saints have promoted or various scriptures have explained, it's all for only one reason, to help you attach your mind to God. Again, no argument, no right, no wrong. Or, to put it the same way, all the ways of doing bhakti are wrong if your mind is not attached to God while you're doing it. And all the ways of doing bhakti are right if your mind is attached to God while you're doing it. So Shri Maharaj Ji said, what's the argument? You attach your mind to God through any practice. Whatever style of worshiping God helps you remember Him, that's correct for you. He said there could be infinite ways of worshiping God. So this is not only inclusive to all people following the traditions within our Vedic scriptures, but it also includes people of other religions who have other ways of worshiping God. Whatever helps you attach your mind to God, that is correct. If your mind is in God, you're worshiping correctly. If you're just doing it as a physical formality, you're worshiping incorrectly. So it's so simple. It's something everybody can understand and accept, because it's not insulting anybody or telling anybody that they're wrong, that your way of worshiping is wrong. It's just explaining the essence behind all worship, being your mind has to be in God. See, I told you, you would be thinking, well, I could have explained this. But yes, that's because you've been listening to Shri Maharaj Ji. Those scholars couldn't explain it. Remember, you've all heard the stories of the Chitrakoot Sammelan, when Shri Maharaj Ji put these very same questions on a sheet of paper and promoted it, that I am inviting all the scholars of India to come and speak on these topics. Answer these questions and contradictions that people are so confused about. And he called all the Jagadgurus of that time and Mahamandaleshwars and great scholars, come and give lectures on these topics. Not a single person addressed any of these contradictions. They all just spoke from their perspective and their understanding. So from our perspective now, we're thinking, oh, this is child's play. I mean, ye kaun si badi baat hai? Aapne kaun si badi baat samjhayi hai aaj? That's because we've been trained by Shri Maharaj Ji. But imagine, those scholars couldn't dare to even undertake answering any of these contradictions. So that's why they were so amazed. Just what I presented to you briefly today, these are some of the deepest confusions, most all-encompassing confusions that people have or had about God. And these confusions have prevailed for thousands of years. And Shri Maharaj Ji was able to reconcile all of this in such a simple, elegant way. So that's why these scholars, they said, we have to think of something special, some extra special way of honoring him. And the best they could come up with was saying, okay, instead of just Adi Jagadguru Kripalu Ji Maharaj, we'll call him Jagadguru Tam, the supreme Jagadguru, because the other Jagadgurus also explain from one perspective without taking the time to reconcile everything. So there are many other topics that Shri Maharaj Ji took the time to reconcile, many other confusions that baffled scholars and public alike. We'll save those for another time. Boliye Vrindavan Bihari Lal Ki.